John Harrow was a man who had everything: a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Manhattan, a collection of cars that could fill an entire garage, and a bank account that could make anyone envious. Yet, in all of his wealth, there was a secret he carried, a dark burden that no one knew about. A secret that had gnawed at his conscience for years, a mistake so severe that it could never be undone. It was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. It was 30 years ago when his life began to unravel, and it all started with his son, Ethan. At just 3 years old, Ethan was diagnosed with a severe disability that would prevent him from living a normal life. The doctors spoke in soft, sympathetic tones, but nothing could prepare John for the weight of the diagnosis. Ethan would never walk, never speak, and would likely need constant care for the rest of his life. To John, this was a death sentence, not just for his son, but for himself. He couldn't fathom the thought of raising a child who would never be able to care for himself. His wife, Samantha, was devastated by the news, but she stood by their son, determined to give him the love and care he deserved. John, however, struggled to cope with the reality of the situation. He felt trapped in a life he didn't want, a life filled with obligations he didn't feel capable of handling. His mind constantly raced with the thought of what his future would look like, the constant demands of a child who would never be independent, the sacrifice of his wealth and career for a life of caregiving. As weeks turned into months, John's frustration grew. He became increasingly distant from Samantha and Ethan, unable to connect with them emotionally. His career flourished, but his personal life was in shambles. He resented his son, not for anything Ethan had done, but for the life that was forced upon him. He began to feel like a prisoner in his own home. One cold winter evening, in a moment of utter despair, John made a decision that would haunt him forever. He packed a small bag, grabbed Ethan from his crib, and drove far away from the city. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove, the weight of his decision growing heavier with each passing mile. The drive took him deep into the forest, a remote area that no one would venture into. He parked the car at the edge of a clearing, his hands trembling as he carried his son out of the vehicle. Ethan, oblivious to his father's turmoil, smiled up at him, his eyes wide with innocence. John could barely look at him. His throat tightened as he placed Ethan on the ground in the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant sounds of wildlife. He stood there for a moment, looking down at his son, his heart breaking with every passing second, and then, without another word, John turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Not once. The decision he made that night was one he would never speak of to anyone. It was a secret that would remain buried deep within him for years. As he drove back home, his mind was numb. There was no guilt, no sorrow, just a cold, empty feeling that he tried to suppress. He couldn't bring himself to face his wife, to tell her what he had done. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her face when she realized their son was gone. Days turned into weeks, and John went about his life as if nothing had happened. He threw himself into his work, focusing on expanding his empire. The memory of that night remained buried in the back of his mind, but it never truly left him. He couldn't escape the image of his son's innocent face, his smile frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the father he had failed to be. Years passed, and John's life continued on its trajectory of success and loneliness. He built his empire, amassed more wealth, and found himself surrounded by people who admired him, but no one ever truly knew him. No one knew the secret he carried, the burden that weighed on his soul. He had everything anyone could ever want, yet he felt emptier than he had ever been. And then, 30 years later, everything changed. It was a cool autumn afternoon when John Harrow received an unexpected letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, the kind of envelope that immediately caught his attention. He had no idea who could be writing to him. As he tore open the envelope and pulled out the single piece of paper inside, his heart skipped a beat. The letter was simple, short, and to the point. Mr. Harrow, you don't know me, but I know you. I know what you did, and I'm coming for you. Prepare yourself. John stared at the letter, his mind racing. His hands trembled, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. It had been 30 years since he had left Ethan in that forest. He thought he had buried that secret forever. But now someone knew. Someone had found out. For a long time, John sat there in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke? A prank by someone who had discovered a hidden part of his past? Or was it something worse, something far more sinister? The years since Ethan's disappearance had been quiet. John had buried his past beneath layers of success, wealth, and power. He had convinced himself that Ethan had never survived. After all, the forest was vast, the wilderness unforgiving. Who could survive out there alone, especially a 3-year-old? Yet the letter made him question everything. John had lived with the guilt of what he had done, but he had never faced any consequences. No one had ever searched for Ethan, at least not in the way he expected. The authorities had assumed the child had simply wandered off and gotten lost in the wilderness. No one had known that John was involved, that John had made the choice to leave his son behind. But now someone knew, and it seemed they were coming for him. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned in his luxurious bed, his thoughts racing. Who could it be? A child from the forest, somehow surviving against the odds? Or perhaps someone who had discovered the truth through some obscure, long-forgotten detail? John had no answers, only questions that gnawed at him. The next morning, John decided to take action. He called his private investigator, a man named Lawrence, and instructed him to find out everything he could about the letter. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly. Lawrence was a seasoned professional, a man who could track down even the most elusive leads. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. As John hung up the phone, he felt a sense of dread creep over him. The life he had built, the wealth and the power, seemed meaningless in the face of the past he had tried so hard to escape. If this letter was real, if someone truly knew what he had done, everything was at risk. His reputation, his fortune, his freedom, it all hung in the balance. Days passed and the unease grew. John couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, following his every move. He started receiving strange phone calls, hang-ups, anonymous whispers, and cryptic messages. Each one made him feel more paranoid, more exposed. Whoever was behind this knew too much, but nothing prepared him for what happened next. One morning, as John arrived at his office, he found a package waiting for him. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, and tied with a simple string. There was no return address, just a faint smell of pine and earth. John's heart sank as he recognized the scent. It was the same smell from the forest, the scent that haunted his memories. Inside the package was a single photograph. A picture of a young man standing in front of a large, overgrown tree. The man in the picture was holding something in his hands, something wrapped in a tattered blanket. The expression on his face was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. It was the same look John had seen on Ethan's face all those years ago. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan had survived, and now, after all these years, Ethan was back. John stood frozen in his office, the photograph shaking in his hands. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one darker than the last. How had Ethan survived? Who had found him? And, most importantly, what did this mean for John? He knew one thing for certain: his past was coming back to haunt him, and there was no escaping it now. The days following the arrival of the photograph were a blur of anxiety and dread. John Harrow could no longer escape the shadow of his past, and it loomed larger with every passing moment. The photograph of Ethan standing by the tree haunted him. There was something about Ethan's eyes in that image that stirred a deep, buried fear within him. He couldn't help but think back to the boy he had left behind all those years ago. John had assumed that Ethan, at 3 years old, had never had the chance to understand what happened that night. He had been so young, so fragile, surely the boy had been too innocent to process the horror of abandonment. But now, looking at the picture, John felt an unsettling certainty that Ethan remembered. He remembered everything. The phone calls continued. The messages grew more cryptic. At first, John had dismissed them, thinking they were just the ramblings of someone trying to make money off his past, but the tone of the voice on the other end of the line was unmistakable, cold, calculated, and devoid of mercy. "Do you remember me, Dad?" the voice asked during one call. The words seemed to echo in John's head long after the line went dead. For days, John struggled to focus on anything other than the growing realization that his son was alive and had somehow found him. But where was he now? What had become of him all these years? Was he still the innocent child John had abandoned, or had he become something darker, something twisted by the wilderness? The more John tried to push these thoughts away, the more they consumed him. He found himself pacing through his mansion late at night, staring out the windows into the dark expanse of the world beyond. The forest was still out there, the same forest where he had left Ethan to die. But now it was a symbol of something far more ominous, a place where his greatest sin had unfolded. John had tried to move on from that night, tried to bury it under a facade of wealth and success, but it was clear that he could never outrun the consequences of what he had done. Ethan's survival was the proof. The proof that John's entire life had been a lie. The phone rang again. John's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to pick it up. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaking with anticipation and fear. There was a long pause before a voice on the other end spoke. "You still don't understand, do you, Dad?" The voice was different this time, older, more assertive, but still eerily familiar. "I'm coming for you. You're going to answer for what you did." John's mind raced. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Tell me who you are." But the line was already dead. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like a thick fog closing in around him. His hands trembled as he slowly placed the receiver back into its cradle. He knew now that the person calling him was not someone seeking revenge out of some vague sense of justice. This was not a stranger. This was his son. Ethan. John's mind flashed back to the moment he had left Ethan in the woods. He remembered the feel of the boy's tiny hand in his as he carried him from the car. He remembered how Ethan had smiled at him, completely unaware of the darkness that his father was about to unleash. And John remembered the sick feeling in his stomach as he turned and walked away, never looking back. But now everything had changed. Ethan had survived. And now Ethan was coming for him. John spent the next several days in a state of near paranoia, constantly looking over his shoulder, never sure if the next knock on his door would be Ethan standing there, demanding answers. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. No matter where he went, no matter how far he tried to distance himself from the past, it felt as though Ethan was always one step behind him. John's private investigator, Lawrence, had turned up nothing. Despite his best efforts, there were no records of a young boy surviving alone in the forest all those years ago. No reports, no sightings. It was as if Ethan had vanished from the world entirely until now. Then, one evening, as the sun set over the city, a knock on John's front door shattered the stillness. John froze. His pulse quickened. He slowly walked to the door, his mind racing with every possibility. He knew who it was. Ethan was here. With a shaky hand, he opened the door, but there was no child. No angry young man standing there to confront him. Instead, a man in his early 30s stood before him, his features hard and unforgiving. His eyes, dark and intense, locked onto John's with a cold fury that sent a chill down John's spine. "You don't recognize me, do you?" the man said. His voice was deep, low, and laced with a bitterness that John had never heard before. John's mouth went dry as he searched the man's face, trying to place him, but it was no use. He didn't recognize him at all. And then, with a gut-wrenching clarity, it hit him. This was Ethan. This was his son. "Ethan," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" The man's eyes narrowed. "It's me, Dad. And I've come for what's mine." John's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest as the reality of the situation sank in. Standing before him was a man, a stranger, but yet someone he knew better than anyone else. This was his son, Ethan. The boy he had abandoned in the forest. The child he had left to die. And now, 30 years later, he was here, in front of him, demanding answers. Ethan's eyes bore into him, filled with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and something else, something darker. John's stomach twisted in knots. He had spent so many years pushing the memory of Ethan out of his mind, burying it beneath the weight of his wealth and success, but now, standing face to face with the consequences of his actions, all of that pretentious security shattered. The truth of his unforgivable decision hung heavy in the air between them. John stammered, unable to form coherent words. His hands shook and he took a step back as though he were trying to retreat from the man before him. But there was nowhere to go. "Ethan. I didn't know you were." Ethan raised a hand to silence him. His fingers were long and his skin was weathered, a stark contrast to the small child John had last seen. His face was hardened by years of survival, a life of suffering that John could not even begin to understand. "You didn't know?" Ethan's voice cracked like thunder. "You didn't know what, Dad? That I was still alive? Or that I'd grow up and find you, come looking for you? That I'd make you pay for what you did?" John's knees wobbled and he steadied himself against the doorframe, struggling to breathe as if the weight of the past had finally caught up with him. The man standing before him was not the child he had once held in his arms, but someone forged in the crucible of unforgiving years. Ethan was no longer that innocent boy. He had become someone else, someone who had survived in the wild, someone who had learned the harsh lessons of life without a father, without the safety of love or care. I never wanted this for you, Ethan," John whispered, the words slipping from his mouth in a torrent of regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd be better off without me. I thought you thought." Ethan's voice grew cold and he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving John's face. "You thought." His hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his arms rippling as if he were restraining the full force of his anger. "You left me to die in the forest, Dad. You didn't think. You didn't care. You just walked away." John's chest tightened, the words like a physical blow. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but every attempt seemed futile. Nothing he could say could undo the past. Nothing could take back what he had done. "I thought you were better off. I thought I couldn't give you the life you deserved." His voice cracked as he admitted the deepest truth that had haunted him for 30 years. "I couldn't care for you. I didn't know how. And I thought, he faltered, looking away, ashamed of the admission. I thought you'd be better off alone in the wilderness. Ethan's lips curled into a bitter, mocking smile. Better off? You left me in the wilderness to die. To fend for myself. No food, no shelter, no hope. He paused, the weight of his words settling between them like an oppressive fog. But I survived, Dad. I survived. And you know what? I became stronger because of it. I learned how to take care of myself, how to survive. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you off the hook. John swallowed hard, his mind swirling in a mixture of guilt and fear. He had no idea what Ethan had gone through all these years, the pain, the hunger, the loneliness. He couldn't even begin to comprehend it. I didn't think you would survive, John muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as though confessing a crime. I didn't think anyone could. But now that I see you, you thought wrong, Ethan interrupted, his eyes flashing with a fiery intensity. I didn't just survive, Dad. I learned. I became the man I am today because of what you did to me. And now it's time to pay the price. John recoiled slightly at the venom in Ethan's words. The young man's anger was justified. There was no question in John's mind about that. He had abandoned his son in the most unforgivable way. What could he possibly say now to make it right? I'm sorry, John whispered, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. I'm sorry, Ethan. I can't change what I did, but I regret it every single day. Please understand that I never wanted to hurt you. Ethan's eyes softened for the briefest moment. There was a flicker of something, maybe the remnants of the child he had once been, the child who might have still craved his father's love and approval. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced once more by the cold, unrelenting man standing before John. I don't need your apology, Ethan said, his voice now steady but with an edge of finality. You can't undo what you did, but you will make things right. That's the only thing left. And you will do it, Dad, because I won't let you forget this. Not for a single day. John's heart sank, and for the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. Ethan wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't seeking closure. He was demanding justice, a justice John knew he could never provide. I'll do anything, John begged, his voice trembling. Anything you want. I'll make amends. Just tell me what you want and I'll give it to you. Please. I need to make this right. Ethan stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then, without saying another word, he turned and began to walk away. I'll be in touch, Ethan said over his shoulder, his voice cold and final. And you'll know when the time comes to pay. John stood there, motionless, watching his son disappear into the night. The weight of what he had done crushed him, and for the first time in decades, John Harrow felt truly afraid. The days that followed Ethan's visit were a blur for John Harrow. He could no longer function with any sense of normalcy. Every waking moment was consumed by the weight of his past, the unbearable reality of what he had done, and the knowledge that his son, the child he had abandoned, was back and demanding retribution. John couldn't escape it, he couldn't escape him. His wealth, his power, his mansion, they all felt meaningless now. None of it could protect him from the truth of his actions. The cold, hard facts of what he had done 30 years ago haunted him at every turn. John tried to distract himself. He buried himself in work, throwing himself into business deals and meetings, hoping that if he kept moving, kept busy, the fear and guilt would somehow dissipate. But it never did. It always lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow that grew longer and darker with every passing moment. And then, 2 weeks after Ethan's visit, the phone rang again. This time, John's heart didn't just race. It froze. He knew who it was before he even picked up the receiver. His hands were clammy as he answered. Hello? You've been thinking about me, haven't you? Ethan's voice came through the phone, smooth and steady, but with an edge of something sinister lurking beneath. I've been thinking about you too, and about everything you owe me. John swallowed, his throat dry. What do you want, Ethan? He asked, his voice hoarse, barely able to contain the anxiety twisting inside him. Please, tell me how I can make this right. I'll do anything. I swear. Ethan's laughter echoed through the phone line, dark and hollow. Anything? You don't get it, do you, Dad? You can't just fix this with money, with gifts, or with empty promises. There's a cost to what you've done. And I'm going to make sure you understand what that cost really is. John's stomach churned. What do you want from me? Just tell me and I'll give it to you. Please. You're going to make a public apology, Ethan said flatly. Not some scripted PR nonsense. A real apology. In front of the entire world. On live television. John's heart sank. No, no, that's impossible. I can't do that. I've built this life, my reputation. You want me to destroy it? That's exactly what I want, Ethan replied. I want you to understand the weight of what you did. The world needs to know who you really are and what kind of man you are. You're going to tell the truth, all of it. The whole world will know what you did to me. John's hands gripped the edge of his desk as if trying to hold on to some shred of stability. His entire life, everything he had worked for, was at risk. He had never once thought about public humiliation. He had been careful, meticulous in controlling his image. But now, his son was taking that power away from him, piece by piece. Ethan, please, John pleaded, his voice cracking. You don't have to do this. I'm sorry. I regret it every day, but I can't just throw everything away. Everything I've built. You're going to have to. Ethan interrupted, his voice growing colder, more commanding. You'll go on live television, and you'll admit to the world that you left me to die. You'll tell them everything. You won't leave out a single detail. John fell silent, the weight of Ethan's demand sinking in. The humiliation, the damage to his reputation, the loss of everything he had worked so hard for. It was too much to bear. But then, in the quiet that followed, a voice inside him whispered, You deserve this. This is your punishment. I'll do it, John whispered, defeated. I'll do whatever you say. But please, don't make me suffer more than I already have. Ethan was silent for a moment, and then, without warning, he spoke again. Good. You'll be on air in 3 days. Make sure you're ready. The line went dead. John sank into his chair, trembling. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe this was happening. Everything he had feared, everything he had tried to avoid, was crashing down on him all at once. The world was about to know the truth. He was going to be exposed as the man who had abandoned his own son in the woods, the man who had left a helpless child to die. But as terrifying as it was, part of him knew he had no choice. This was the price for his sins. For the next 3 days, John prepared himself for the public reckoning that awaited him. He sat in front of mirrors, rehearsing his words, his apology. He practiced the speech he would give, but no matter how many times he said it, it never felt real. It never felt like enough. His guilt consumed him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face, saw that cold, unforgiving stare. The child he had left behind had become a man who demanded his reckoning. The night before the broadcast, John stood in front of the television in his living room. The same TV he had watched so many important moments on. His business deals, his political triumphs, his wealth and success paraded before him. But tomorrow everything would change. He wasn't going to be the man he had always pretended to be. Tomorrow, the world would see him for who he truly was. He couldn't undo the past. But he would face it. And somehow, he hoped that by doing so, he could find a way to live with himself. The morning of the broadcast, John Harrow woke up earlier than usual, his heart already pounding in his chest. His usual routines felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't about to face the entire world and admit the darkest secret of his life. The very air in the mansion felt heavy, as though it too was holding its breath for the moment that was about to come. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for the man he used to be, the man who had everything, who could command the world with a mere glance. But the person staring back at him was different. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and hollow from sleepless nights spent worrying about what was to come. The arrogance he had worn like a badge of honor for so many years was gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable dread. He was about to lose everything. His wealth, his reputation, his influence. All of it. But worst of all, he was about to lose his pride. And that, he thought bitterly, was probably the most fitting punishment for what he had done. At precisely 10 a.m., a sleek black car arrived outside the mansion. Ethan had arranged everything. There was no turning back now. John could feel the pit in his stomach growing deeper as he climbed into the car, the familiar hum of the engine now sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down the moments until his life as he knew it would be over. the ride to the television studio felt interminable. John stared out the window, watching the world pass by in a blur of colors and shapes. He thought about what he had done, about the 3-year-old boy he had abandoned in the forest. He thought about the suffering, the loneliness, the survival. But most of all, he thought about the face of his son, the man who had survived, who had found him, and who was now forcing him to pay for his crimes. The car finally pulled up to the studio, and John stepped out, feeling as though his knees might buckle beneath him. A team of production assistants quickly ushered him into a small room backstage, where a makeup artist was waiting to prepare him for the broadcast. They fussed over him, smoothing his hair, applying makeup to hide the bags under his eyes, but John barely noticed. It all felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. "Mr. Harrow, we're ready for you," a technician said, snapping John out of his daze. He nodded absently and followed the technician down a long hallway, each step bringing him closer to the stage, to the moment he had dreaded for so long. The studio lights were blinding when he stepped onto the stage, and the cameras were trained on him, cold and unblinking. The audience was already seated, murmuring quietly among themselves. But when John took his seat in front of the host, the room fell into a tense silence. The host, a well-known journalist with a reputation for tough interviews, greeted him with a practiced smile. "Mr. Harrow, thank you for joining us today. I know this is not easy for you, but we appreciate your willingness to speak out." John's heart raced, and he tried to swallow the lump in his throat. His palms were slick with sweat, and he could feel the weight of every eye in the studio on him. The host continued, "You've come here today to make an important announcement, one that has been long overdue. Before we get into that, could you tell us a little about your journey?" John took a deep breath, his voice faltering as he began. I've spent the last 30 years trying to bury a mistake," he said, his words coming out slower than he intended. "A mistake that haunts me every single day. And I've come here today because I owe the world, and especially my son, the truth. It's the least I can do." The host nodded, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Your son, Ethan Harrow, has made some very serious allegations against you. He claims that you abandoned him when he was just 3 years old, that you left him in the forest, alone and helpless." John's breath caught in his chest. The words seemed to echo in his mind, each syllable another weight on his conscience. He stopped himself, trying to steady his voice. "I didn't think I was abandoning him. I thought I was doing what was best. I was scared, and I didn't know how to be a father." His voice broke, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "But that doesn't excuse what I did. What I did was unforgivable." He paused, his hands trembling as he clasped them together in his lap. He glanced down for a moment, then met the camera with his gaze. "I left my son in the forest. I walked away from him, and for that, I can never forgive myself." The silence in the room was deafening. John could feel the weight of his confession sinking in. There was no going back. The world was watching, and he had laid bare his darkest secret for everyone to see. The host leaned forward, her tone gentle yet firm. "And now, 30 years later, your son is here, and he's demanding an apology, an explanation. He's demanded that you make this right. What do you say to that?" John's chest tightened. He felt the eyes of the world on him, but more than that, he felt the presence of Ethan, standing somewhere in the wings, watching. The man he had abandoned, the child who had become a stranger. "I am so sorry," John said, his voice breaking as the words finally tumbled out. "I am so sorry, Ethan. I failed you, I betrayed you, and I can never undo the damage I've caused. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. If you can ever forgive me, I will spend every day trying to prove that I'm worthy of being your father again." There was a long pause, and John's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wasn't sure what kind of reaction he was expecting, whether Ethan would show up on stage, whether the audience would react with sympathy or disdain. All he knew was that he had finally spoken the truth, and now, there was nothing left but the waiting. And then, as if on cue, the screen behind John flickered to life, and Ethan appeared. His face was cold, unreadable, and for a moment, John wondered if his son would even acknowledge his apology. But Ethan spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've said your piece, Dad. Now, I want you to understand something. This isn't over." John's heart sank. He knew this was just the beginning. The screen flickered as Ethan's face filled it, a stark contrast to John's own worn expression. Ethan was calm, collected, his posture rigid, almost regal. He looked nothing like the 3-year-old John had left behind in the woods. Gone was the helpless child, replaced by a man hardened by years of pain and vengeance. John's pulse quickened as he watched his son's steady gaze. Every inch of him seemed composed, yet there was a palpable coldness that made John's skin crawl. "Ethan," John said softly, almost pleading, as if somehow his son would hear the remorse in his voice and soften. But Ethan didn't give him the chance to explain any further. "Enough?" Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You don't get to decide how this ends. I do. And you're going to learn the hard way that nothing you say can fix what you've done." John felt the weight of those words sink in, a crushing realization that the apology was never going to be enough. Nothing could truly heal the wounds of abandonment. Ethan paused before continuing, his eyes narrowing with purpose. "You left me in that forest, Dad. I was 3 years old. You didn't just walk away from a child, you walked away from a future. My future. And you think a few words, some empty apology, can make it better? You think that will make up for the years of suffering, the isolation, the feeling of being unwanted? You think you can undo all that with a public confession?" John shook his head, his chest tight. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? How could he possibly convey the depths of his regret? How could he make Ethan understand that no amount of public acknowledgement could ever undo the pain? "Do you know what it was like, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice growing colder. "What it was like to grow up with the knowledge that you had a father who didn't care enough to keep you alive. To live with the idea that your own flesh and blood, the person who should have protected you, discarded you like garbage in the woods." John winced as though each word struck him like a physical blow. He didn't speak for a long moment, his mind grappling with Ethan's words. He trailed off, his throat tight, emotion clogging his voice. "I didn't know. I thought—" "No," Ethan cut him off sharply. "You didn't think. That's the problem." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes burning with intensity. "I grew up with nothing, Dad. Nothing but my pain. I lived with that. I survived on my own, all because of your choice. And now, you think you can just come here and apologize? You think that's enough?" John's heart dropped as he realized just how little he had understood of Ethan's life. He had been so consumed by his own guilt and fear, so blinded by his desire to preserve his image, that he had never truly stopped to think about the consequences of his actions. Ethan had been alone for years, growing into a man who had been forced to live with the scars of that abandonment. "I've spent my entire life wondering why," Ethan continued, his voice now tight with barely controlled emotion. "Why didn't you care? Why didn't you fight for me? Why did you think it was okay to just leave me out there?" Ethan's words were like daggers. John could feel each one tear at him, unraveling the fragile shell of self-defense he had built for himself over the years. How could he have been so blind? How could he have justified his actions in his own mind for all these years? "I don't have any answers for you, Ethan. I can't change what I did," John said, his voice breaking. "I can't undo it. But I swear to you, I've never stopped thinking about you. I've never stopped regretting that day. I've never stopped wishing I could go back and fix it." Ethan's eyes flared with a mixture of fury and something deeper, something that looked almost like hurt. "Fix it? Fix it," he repeated, his voice rising. "You can't fix what you've done. No apology, no amount of money, no grand gestures will ever fix that. You think because you're rich, because you have power, you can buy your way out of this? You think you can just fix this with words and a fancy TV appearance?" John's chest tightened. "I know I can't fix it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to try. I've tried for years, Ethan. I've tried to find a way to make it right." Ethan stood up from the screen, his face barely visible now, but his voice still cutting through the air with chilling precision. Well, you can try all you want, but you'll never make it right. The only thing left for you is to live with what you've done. And you will. Every day for the rest of your life. He paused, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. I will never forgive you. I'll never forget what you did. And I'll make sure you understand what it feels like to be abandoned, to be left alone, to be forgotten. Before John could respond, Ethan's face vanished from the screen. The studio erupted in a sudden, stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. John sat frozen in his chair, his mind spinning, unable to process the reality of what had just happened. The host, who had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, looked at John with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Mr. Harrow, I think we've heard enough for today. We'll give you a moment to collect yourself. But John didn't move. He didn't even register the host's words. He was lost in his own thoughts, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on him like a crushing avalanche. He had never imagined it would be like this. He had hoped, maybe naively, that after all these years of distance, there might be a chance for reconciliation. That somehow, in the face of his apology, Ethan might soften, might allow the possibility of healing. But no, Ethan's anger was justified. Ethan's pain was real. And John realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was the architect of all that suffering. He had no right to expect anything from his son. Not forgiveness, not compassion, not understanding. Ethan was right. There was no easy fix. There was only the long, painful road of consequences that John would have to walk alone. John was left in the studio's quiet aftermath, the host's gentle words lost in the haze of his own thoughts. The room was still, as though time itself had frozen to witness his unraveling. The audience, whose eyes had been glued to the screen just moments ago, now sat in stunned silence. It was clear that what had just transpired was no ordinary confession. It was a raw, unapologetic outpouring of decades of pain, a wound so deep that even the most eloquent apology couldn't touch its edges. The host, a seasoned professional, realized that there was no more ground to cover in the interview. She gave John a moment to collect himself before signaling the crew to end the segment. The lights dimmed, and the crew began to move about, breaking the illusion of the live broadcast. But for John, the world had already become a blur of fractured moments. He didn't know where he was, who was around him, or how much time had passed since the last words were spoken. I don't think I'm ready to leave, John said. His voice cracked with a mix of exhaustion and resignation. His body felt heavy, as though the weight of his sins had suddenly become unbearable. The host, though still composed, seemed to soften. Mr. Harrow, she said, her tone much gentler now. You've made a decision to come here to face this. You've said your part. There's nothing more you need to do today. But John's mind wasn't on the host or the interview. His thoughts were consumed by Ethan. The image of his son, no longer a helpless child but a hardened man, was etched into his mind like a scar he could never erase. The fire in Ethan's eyes, the pain in his voice, it all felt like a relentless storm, crashing down upon him, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. The confrontation had left John shaken, hollowed out. It was as though his son's words had peeled back the last remnants of a facade he'd built over the years. For the first time in decades, John understood what it meant to be truly alone. Ethan had made it clear that there was no room for reconciliation. Not now, not ever. The harshness of that truth stung, and John struggled to find his footing in the crushing silence that followed. As the crew bustled around, finishing the cleanup from the broadcast, he remained seated, staring blankly at the floor, lost in thought. The weight of his past had come crashing into his present, and he didn't know how to move forward. It wasn't until he was alone in his dressing room that John felt the full magnitude of what had transpired. He slumped into the chair in front of the vanity mirror, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests. His reflection stared back at him, unrecognizable, a man broken by his own mistakes. He closed his eyes, trying to make sense of it all. For years, he had lived in the illusion that wealth and power could shield him from his past. That the public persona he had crafted, successful, untouchable, and beyond reproach, was enough to protect him from the truth. But in the end, it was all a lie. Ethan had stripped it all away, leaving him exposed, and yet, despite the overwhelming guilt and shame that clung to him, John couldn't deny that part of him still wanted to fight. A small, flickering part of him refused to accept that this was the end. But what could he do? What could possibly undo the damage he had caused? His thoughts turned once again to his son. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, louder now. He could still hear the accusation, the pain, the devastation in Ethan's voice. He could still feel the fury that had radiated from him during their brief exchange. But beneath that fury, there had been something else, something John had seen in his eyes, even if only for a moment. Sorrow. Ethan had been hurt. Ethan had suffered, and it was John who had caused that suffering. There were no quick fixes. No redemption that could be bought. No amount of wealth or influence could change what had happened. But John couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, he owed it to Ethan, he owed it to himself to at least try. The days that followed were a blur of press conferences, public statements, and the relentless scrutiny of the media. John Harrow, once a powerful and influential figure, had now become the subject of a national conversation. Headlines screamed accusations, TV anchors dissected every word he had said in the broadcast, and social media exploded with opinions both for and against him, but through it all, John could barely focus on anything but Ethan. The world's judgment was nothing compared to the judgment he felt in his own heart. What had he expected from his son? Forgiveness? Understanding? No, he had been foolish to think that it was the night after the broadcast when John finally made the decision. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps there was still something he could do. He picked up his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed the one number he knew he had to call. The phone rang, the sound of it echoing in the silence of his room. When the voicemail beeped, John took a deep breath and left a message. Ethan, I don't expect you to call back. I don't expect anything. But I need you to know that I'm still here. I'm still trying. I know you hate me, and you should. I'll never be able to undo the damage I've caused. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need you to know that I'm not going to walk away this time. I can't fix what I've done, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I can be better. He ended the message, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. It was the first real step he had taken in decades, but as he hung up the phone, John felt something he hadn't expected: hope. A fragile, fleeting hope that somehow, some way, his son might find it in himself to speak to him again. That maybe, just maybe, the wound could begin to heal. Days passed, and John continued to live in the shadow of his own choices. The world around him seemed to close in, the pressure of the public's eyes never easing. Yet, despite the ongoing media frenzy and relentless scrutiny, a small glimmer of hope lingered in his chest. He knew, deep down, that he could never undo the years of absence, the cruelty of abandoning his own son. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for something, anything, to repair the broken connection. His phone remained silent. No calls from Ethan. No messages. John had expected this. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that one voicemail would be enough to bridge the gap of 30 years. But each day without a response ate away at him, a constant reminder of the rift between them. Still, he didn't give up. He couldn't. The thought of going back to his old life, pretending that nothing had changed, that he hadn't just exposed his deepest regret to the world, was unbearable. So, John stayed the course. He continued with his public appearances, doing his best to keep up the facade, while in private, he worked tirelessly to find ways to reach Ethan. Weeks turned into months, and every day, John checked his phone, hoping for a message that would never come. The absence was suffocating. He began to realize that the man he had become, the wealthy, powerful businessman who could have anything he wanted, was nothing without his son. His wealth, his influence, his accomplishments, none of it mattered. All he wanted was Ethan. But the longer he waited, the more the weight of his failure pressed down on him. Then, one evening, as John sat alone in his mansion, he received an unexpected call. It was from the investigator he had hired weeks ago. The one he had tasked with finding Ethan. John had kept his search discreet, not wanting to intrude on Ethan's life further. But after months of dead ends, he had hoped this might be the breakthrough he needed. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but direct. "Mr. Harrow, we found him." John's heart leapt in his chest. "Where is he?" His voice was rough, the urgency unmistakable. "He's living in a small town up north," the investigator continued. "It's a place called Clearwater. Very remote. We've confirmed that he's been living there for several years now under a different name." John's mind raced, thoughts of Ethan filling every corner of his consciousness. "How can I contact him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a contact address," the investigator replied, "but I should warn you, sir. Ethan's not someone you can just approach. He's kept to himself for a reason. He's built a life there, and from what we've gathered, he's very protective of his privacy. John nodded, though the investigator couldn't see it. I understand. Just send me the details. Please. After the call ended, John sat there, his mind in turmoil. For the first time, he felt both hope and fear in equal measure. The thought of seeing Ethan again, of finally being face to face with the son he had abandoned, was both a dream and a nightmare. He had no idea what Ethan would say, or if he would even allow him into his life, but John knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had to try. He couldn't live the rest of his life wondering what could have been. This was his last chance, and he would take it whatever the cost. The journey to Clearwater was long and uneventful. John traveled in solitude, his thoughts heavy with anticipation and dread. The closer he got to the small town, the more his nerves began to fray. He had no idea what he would say to Ethan when they met. Would his son even acknowledge him? Or would he tell John to turn around and never look back? As John pulled into the town of Clearwater, he was struck by its simplicity. The town was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaotic, fast-paced life he had left behind. It was the kind of place that seemed immune to the outside world, a place where people went to disappear. John followed the directions he had been given, eventually arriving at a modest house on the outskirts of town. It was small, humble, but there was something about it that made John pause. It was Ethan's home, the place where he had built his life after everything John had done. The thought of stepping onto that land felt like a violation, as if he was intruding on a life he had no right to be a part of. He took a deep breath and got out of the car, his legs trembling slightly. He approached the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and there stood Ethan. John froze. Ethan was standing before him, no longer the angry young man he had seen on television, but a man in his 30s, strong, confident, and hardened by life. His expression was unreadable, but John saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was the same look Ethan had given him all those years ago, but this time it was tempered by something else, something far deeper. I wasn't sure if you would come, Ethan said, his voice quiet but steady. I didn't know if I wanted you to. John swallowed hard. I had to come, Ethan. I know I don't deserve this, but I had to see you. I had to try. Ethan didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes scanning John's face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick with the weight of their shared history. Finally, Ethan stepped aside, his hand moving toward the door in a gesture that could have been an invitation or a dismissal. Come inside, he said. But I can't promise you anything. John nodded, stepping across the threshold, knowing that this was the beginning of something he could never have imagined. Whether this was the start of reconciliation or the end of the road, he didn't know. But he was here, and that was all he could control. The air inside Ethan's home was warm but still, filled with the scent of wood, faint coffee, and something that reminded John of a simpler time. The place was sparsely decorated, functional, neat, yet lived in. Photographs lined a nearby shelf. John couldn't help but glance at them. Some were of Ethan in nature, others with a woman and a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. A family. Ethan noticed John's gaze. Her name is Lily. She's my daughter. John's breath caught. He's a father. The thought filled him with an ache he hadn't expected. He'd missed everything, his son's childhood, his growth, and now this. The next generation. She's beautiful, John said, voice hoarse. Ethan nodded but didn't offer a smile. You didn't come here for small talk. Say what you need to say. John lowered himself onto the edge of a wooden chair in the kitchen, feeling like an intruder in a sacred place. He took a long, slow breath. I know I have no right to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not time, not even your attention. But I came here because I needed to face you. Not in front of cameras or the world, but man to man, father to son. If I can still call myself that. Ethan remained standing, arms crossed, leaning against the counter. You forfeited that title a long time ago, John. John nodded. I know, and I don't blame you. I was a coward. I thought money and influence could insulate me from the truth, from guilt. But nothing ever did. I thought I could erase you from my life. But all I ever did was erase myself from yours. He paused, his eyes now shimmering. I thought I was freeing myself from shame when I left you, but all I did was sentence myself to a lifetime of it. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. Do you have any idea what it was like? I woke up crying for days after you left. The old woman who found me in the forest, Miriam, she said I was barely breathing when she picked me up. I had pneumonia. I almost died. John closed his eyes, guilt crashing over him in waves. You knew I was disabled, and you left me to die like a stray dog, and somehow I survived. I learned to walk. I got stronger, and I worked hard. I worked so hard to never be like you. You succeeded? John whispered. Ethan blinked, taken slightly aback. You succeeded in becoming everything I wasn't, John continued. A protector, provider, a man of honor. I may have given you life, but it was you who gave it meaning. You became the kind of father I never had the courage to be. A silence hung in the room. I didn't come here to ask for a place in your life. I didn't even come to be forgiven, John said. But if there's any way I could know my granddaughter, even from a distance, or support you in some way, I'd like to offer that. If you'll let me. Ethan's face twisted in conflict. Pain, anger, and something close to empathy warred in his expression. I don't know if I can forgive you, he finally said. There's a lot of damage, a lot of broken pieces, and I've spent my entire life trying to glue them back together. I don't expect forgiveness, John said quietly. Only a chance to try. Ethan looked down, his thoughts drifting. Lily's never met her grandfather. She only knows one side of the story. My side. The truth as I saw it. But maybe one day, she deserves to decide for herself. He walked to the table and sat across from John, his voice softer now. But it's not about her yet. It's about you and me. You want a chance? Then earn it. Not with words, with presence, with consistency. John nodded, a glimmer of hope surfacing. I will, whatever it takes. For the first time, Ethan allowed a tiny crack in the wall he had built. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was something. Perhaps the first brick removed from a fortress of pain. Later, as John walked back to his car, he glanced one last time at the house where his son lived. The sun was setting behind it, casting golden light across the porch. It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was the beginning of something precious. A second chance? And this time, John wasn't going to walk away.